Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hannig, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. One summer in Athens over a decade ago, I was lucky enough to see a performance of the Rhesus ascribed to Euripides, staged in a production by the renowned opera and theater director Katerina Evangelatou. It was a hot midsummer night, I remember, which made the setting all the more evocative. The performance took place at the site of Aristotle's Lyceum. Evangelatou called the production a peripatetic performance, and audience members were divided up into groups and guided around the grounds as the play unfolded. Euripides' Rhesus, you probably know, is a play of disputed authorship. It's based on the Doloneia of Iliad Book 11, in which Odysseus and Diomedes undertake a night raid on the Trojan camp. There they end up slaying the newly arrived Thracian king Rhesus and stealing his fabled horses. In the tragedy version, the play concludes, or nearly does, with the appearance of Rhesus's mother, Ex Machina. She is one of the Muses, and in her scene, she both sings a lament for her dead son and gives a speech laying blame on Odysseus for his murder. At various points in the performance, short extracts from Aristotle's minor work on dreams would be projected onto nearby buildings. Those extracts, if I recall correctly, mostly had to do with Aristotle's ideas about why the mind is so easily fooled by dreams. Why, when we sleep, we can't discern what is real from what is not. In sleep, we are disarmed of our wits, and we react to every illusion as if it were reality. The juxtaposition of these passages with the unfolding action of the Rhesus was chilling. The Rhesus is the only surviving Greek tragedy that takes place exclusively at night. The passages of Aristotle challenged spectators to wonder how much of what was happening in the play was happening because the characters themselves were out of their senses, rashly acting on illusions and delusions as if they were in a dream state. But the play also invited spectators to imagine that what we ourselves were witnessing was also, in a way, no more than a dream. Aristotle's On Dreams is just one of the many ancient texts that my guest for this episode, Mirjam E. Kotwick, discusses in her brand new book, The Ancient Interpretation of Dreams, Early Greek Hermeneutics and Its Sources. In the book, she traces how Greek thinkers from Homer to Aristotle approached the problem of dream interpretation, and argues that this tradition has much to tell us about the early history of hermeneutics more broadly, about how the ancient Greeks thought through questions of language, metaphor, and figurative meaning long before such questions were formalized by philosophers and literary critics. Along the way, Mirjam makes the case that dream interpretation, so often and for so long dismissed as superstition and overlooked in histories of ancient thought, was in fact one of Greek antiquity's busiest laboratories for thinking about how signs, words, images, other aspects of language can all mean something other than what they seem. When I read Mirjam's book, I certainly found myself on several occasions thinking back to that summer night in the Lyceum, where the production of Rhesus, threaded as it was with Aristotle's observations on dreams, invited the audience members to become dream interpreters themselves, ourselves. After all, what is theater but another kind of illusion, one in which, as Gorgias said, the one who is deceived is actually wiser than the one who is not. Mirjam E. Kotwick is Associate Professor of Classics at Princeton University. She has published articles and monographs on Greek philosophy and literature and their textual traditions, including Alexander of Aphrodisias and the text of Aristotle's Metaphysics and Der Papyrus von Derveni. Her most recent book is The Ancient Interpretation of Dreams, Early Greek Hermeneutics and Its Sources, which just came out with Princeton University Press. A quick reminder that, as ever, I have put some references in the show notes for this episode, and also that Lesche is on Instagram, at Lesche Podcast. That's where I announce new episodes, so you might want to give us a follow there. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Mirjam E. Kotwick. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
The origin of this book lays in my second book, which is on the Derveni Papyrus, a project on the Derveni Papyrus, a 5th century or around 400 BCE written text by an anonymous author who interprets an Orphic theogonic poem in an allegorical way, with allegoresis. That means translating the poem and the mythical figures in it into a physical cosmology of the kind of that we know from Anaxagoras, for instance. And that kind of interpretation has been known well and has been very successful in later parts of antiquity. But we didn't really have an example that is so early as the Derveni Papyrus of this kind of reading a text. So I got, in working on the Derveni Papyrus, really interested in better understanding how that kind of interpretive approach to a text works. And as I just said, since there's not much in that early time period of that kind, the only place where I could find an approach to, let's say, language or text-like items was dream interpretation. And there was really kind of a wealth of evidence of this kind of approach. It's not exactly identical, but very, very similar. And especially in its sort of hermeneutic attitudes towards the object of interpretation, it is very similar. And in seeing that connection between allegorical interpretation of a poem and the way that ancient authors from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives read, explain, interpret dreams. So when I saw that connection, I really wanted to dig deeper and understand that more. And I also realized that there is not too much work done on the vast field of dream interpretation in the ancient world for a variety of reasons. Probably one obvious one might be that it's regarded as a kind of, I don't know, as just a sign of superstition, or it doesn't have very good press for a variety of reasons. And yeah, so I really thought, since many different authors from various backgrounds, as I already said, are interested in dream interpretation in the ancient world, I thought we should take them more seriously ourselves and see what kind of interesting thinking is happening in the context of understanding dreams. So that was sort of the way that brought me to that project. And an additional factor probably was that I find dreams fascinating, and that helped me finding this topic interesting. Yeah.
But what I think is really incredible about this book is really a different approach, because I feel like I have seen a little, nothing very comprehensive, but some literature here and there on dreams, and I think people tend to be interested in dreams. But the way that you kind of came to this archive, not because you were starting from a place of being really into dreams or something, but because you had this set of questions, and it seemed like this was actually the archive that was hidden in plain sight to start getting at these questions about hermeneutics and origins of linguistics and ideas of metaphor and things like that. So one thing that I'm wondering from the start is, how did you go about curating this archive? And what I mean by that is maybe picking your endpoints, for example, because you end with Aristotle before we get antiquities first surviving the Oneirokritika, even if there are other texts that, like the Hippocratic texts that have dream interpretation material in it. But how did you choose which authors you were going to look at?
So that was part of what drove me, or what really made me interested in that. I wanted to look at the time period before Artemidorus, which is our sort of first starting point. There we really have an extensive text about dream interpretation. There are numerous points that point to a long tradition of this kind of practice, but we have no text, or almost no text like Artemidorus extant before that. So how can we try to get access, nevertheless, to this kind of discourse or practice? And I think, even though at first you might think there's not much there is actually a lot there. When you look at literary texts, that's like Homer and drama. When you look at early scientific writings, like the Hippocratic text on Regimen, for instance, and of course philosophical texts like Plato, and of course, Aristotle has 2 treatises that cover dreams and questions around that are relevant in his time, which is the question whether dreams can predict the future. And so if you take these texts seriously, and of course they work individually in different ways with dreams, but yeah, if you take them seriously, you see that there's a lot going on, so to speak, and that they almost, you see like a continuous sort of interest in a certain set of problems that come with dreams.
And one of the things that I also loved about the book and that I really want listeners to grasp is that in the examples that you pick, that you analyze, there are cases where we witness the work of dream interpretation happening, right? So it's not that just that you've come up with a compendium of all of the dreams mentioned in, from Homer to Aristotle. But your work actually really reminded me of your colleague now emeritus at Princeton, Andrew Ford's Origins of Criticism, where Andrew talks about, he introduces this concept of the critical scene, where in poetry or in literature that we wouldn't necessarily have thought of as works of literary criticism, there are critical scenes where somebody performs a piece of poetry and then somebody else reacts to it within the scene itself. And it struck me that this is the kind of thing that you tend to be interested in, especially for the first part of the book, is scenes in which a dream is recounted, but then we also witness the hermeneutic work of interpretation happening before us. Could you say a little bit more about that choice or kind of what you were looking for in those sorts of scenes?
Yes, absolutely. So, yes, I was really looking for dreams that are interpreted rather than dreams generally. And yeah, I wanted to see how the problem of how to understand a dream, or the question of what this dream means, and that it means something, is a presupposition that is widely shared and in these among these ancient authors. So to see how the thinker, the writer, presents the dream and its interpretation as grappling with a certain kind of problem. And that problem, I believe, reaches out broadly in the sense and relates to questions of language and understanding more generally. Dreams, I propose, were seen as an interesting case of what we might think of as figurative language, that it says something but means something else, or that it says something through something else by means of something else. These are descriptive ways of capturing what the work of a metaphor, for instance. And I think that dreams and the problems they present in the kind of format that they have invited the ancients to think about what happens when we understand language that speaks indirectly, figuratively, and in these kind of ways.
So these cases where we witness or hear characters interpreting dreams, we're getting these windows opened onto just kind of how hermeneutics are working more generally speaking. I think this is a really exciting approach of the book. Well, maybe we could really dig in with a dream that I think a lot of listeners will be familiar with, which is Penelope's dream, the dream that she recounts to the disguised Odysseus in the Odyssey. Do you mind just giving a quick synopsis of what she says that dream was to begin with?
Right. So she shares this dream with Odysseus, who at this point is still in disguise for her. And she dreams that an eagle comes to her house and kills all her geese. And she's very upset about that. And at that point, the eagle sort of acquires a human voice and interprets that dream vision for her. And it goes like this: the eagle that comes from the mountain is Odysseus, who comes from far away, and the eagle who kills the geese will be Odysseus, who kills the suitors. And that is, in the books, I take that as a kind of starting point of the discussion that we then have through later centuries on the kind of dreams that we deal with here, so dreams that depict a short narrative or a visual sort of scene, and that come with the suggestion, and in this case, the interpretation is part of the dream, that the literal, even though the literal is of course a difficult concept itself, that the literal depiction, the literal scene of the dream is not what the dream actually conveys. There's a different meaning behind it, under it, however you want to think of that, that contains the prediction of a future event, that in this case is Odysseus' killing of the suitors. And I take that as the starting point in the sense of that I use it to lay out what I describe as the hermeneutics of similarity, which entails basically 4 steps. First, the expectation that the dream means something other than it says. Second, that you need to focus on specific characters in that little narrative you have, or specific words in that narrative. That brings you to the 3rd step, which is to identify a similarity either between the character in the dream and its supposed meaning, or a word or expression in the dream that is similar to its supposed true meaning. And those similarities can be, as I just said, either what I call thematic or formal. Thematic is something like, comes close to what we think of as metaphor. So Odysseus, the eagle represents Odysseus because they share similarities. They come back from far away, or they are described in similar ways. And the geese are the suitors. They also share certain characteristics. And formal similarities would be that an expression that describes the eagle sounds or puns on an expression that describes Odysseus. So these 2 types of similarities are at play, and they allow for a 4th step that then claims that when we have an eagle and geese interacting in the dream, it really means or signifies Odysseus interacting with the suitors. And that is at play in that scene, and it gets interestingly discussed afterwards through Penelope's famous comments about gates through which dreams issue, in which she interestingly takes up and plays with those hermeneutics that are used in the dream interpretation, even though she doubts that this interpretation is correct. And so we have here a wonderful scene that has all the ingredients already there, so to speak, of what is later, in later tradition, taken up as the kinds of problems you want to think about when you think about dreams.
And you point out, too, that by looking at the scene in this way, that it throws into relief interpretive strategies writ large in the Homeric poems, because there's similar strategies being applied in bird sign interpretation, in Iliad 12, and even in kind of magical practices, I think you call them, with the almost spells being cast. I guess I don't know how else to describe it. So you see this as a window again into broader strategies of interpreting signs through hermeneutics of similarity.
Right. This is a kind of thin line I try to walk throughout the book, that I, of course, want to be aware of the fact that dream interpretation itself was not completely an isolated phenomenon. No, it was interestingly related to other divinatory practices, such as, for instance, the interpretation of bird signs in the Iliad. Also, I show that with an example. And that also holds for later development. When I look in dream interpretation in the 5th century, I also want to be aware that the way that oracles are portrayed, for instance, in Herodotus, have interesting connections with dream interpretation. So that said, however, I do focus specifically on dream interpretation because I think that it is in dream interpretation specifically and much more pronounced than, for instance, in the interpretation of bird signs or even oracles, that ancient thinkers thought about these hermeneutic questions that I want to foreground. I think dream interpretation is a much more fertile ground for thinking about these problems than other forms of divination, even though there are interesting relations.
Yeah, I guess dreams can be so dense with the signs.
Yes, and dreams are connected to language in a way that other, like bird signs, for instance,
Right.
are not. And that is used in the discourse around dreams.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. Yeah, no, thanks for that. Well, could you maybe just say, because I think listeners will also be curious to hear a little bit about this, that in this first chapter on Penelope's dream, where you use Penelope's dream as a launch pad, you also discuss some other hermeneutic traditions from the ancient Mediterranean, ancient Near East. So Egypt, Hebrew Bible kind of thing. Do you mind just saying a few words about how unusual or not is what we see in Homer?
Generally speaking, I should say that the phenomenon of interpreting dreams is, from an anthropological perspective, it's not unique to any specific time or geographical region. It seems to be really a constant human interest. And it is an interesting question of how the different techniques of interpreting relate in cultures that have certainly no direct interaction. But that's a different question, and I'm not asking that question. However, I do look at ancient cultures in the vicinity of Greece, let's say, that precede the evidence in Homer, and that, without sort of going at all into the question of how the relationship can be explained, that exhibit interesting questions and approaches to dreams as well. Now, the evidence is sometimes limited, but it is there. So I briefly discuss dream interpretation in the Epic of Gilgamesh and another Akkadian dream book that lists dreams and their interpretation. And what I highlight is that especially what I call formal similarities that rely on punning or interesting phonetic similarities between words that are semantically unrelated, that approach to dreams is especially foregrounded in the Akkadian evidence, for instance, which, due to the fact that it is in cuneiform script, allows for a much more sophisticated punning than is actually the case in the Greek language and script. So I gesture to it as a larger background that is there, but then having gestured to it, focus really on what happened in the Greek authors from Homer to Aristotle and how they thought about dreams.
So how does, say, what we see in terms of dreams and their interpretation in Aeschylus build on or adjust the strategy that we see Penelope demonstrating in the Odyssey?
So my examples from Aeschylus, they focus on a certain kind of problem or interest in words that can have multiple meanings, and especially if those words have meanings that are in opposition to each other. So when we look at the libation bearers, Clytemnestra's dream of the snake she is nursing, who then bites her, and that is interpreted by Orestes as the snake as being himself, who will kill his mother, who nursed him, and he's in a very exemplary way bringing out the similarities between the snake that she nurses and baby Orestes to justify this interpretation. And to pick out one example, what Aeschylus does here is he plays with the word terras, which has a multiplicity of meaning, and he plays that out in the way the dream is interpreted. Terras can mean snake, basically, that's the basic meaning, but it can also mean more generally monster, that captures then in different ways what Orestes will turn out to be to Clytemnestra. At the same time, Terras is an ominous sign, as the word can mean that, and hence it plays with, in this case, the ominous sign is also the dream, which makes Orestes being the snake and the ominous sign for his own mother being, in a sense, identified through his interpretation of the dream with the dream itself. And I think that is an interesting example of how Aeschylus likes to use dream interpretation and discourse around it to test out what happens with words in the multiplicity of meanings that they can have, which is something he plays out in various ways. The yoke and other words in Atotha's dream in the Persians, it runs in some ways parallel to that.
So would you say that as we go, if we chart the trajectory from Homer and then into Aeschylus, Herodotus, Euripides, Sophocles, do you see more of an abstraction of an idea of language as a hermeneutic for dreams? Do the authors start, I guess, becoming kind of more interested in what we were talking about earlier, in the linguistic element specifically of dreams, and not just what's said in a dream, but the words that you might use to describe a dream, and then all the signifiers and sound-alikes and puns and things that could be roped in?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And I think that's visible, or becomes visible to a certain extent, if we look in the 5th century and how early theoretical approaches to language that we see in certain so-called sophistic authors and their interests in language, how that is interestingly similar and related to the depiction of dream interpretation in very contemporaneous texts. For instance, I use as a starting point in the 4th chapter Aristophanes' Wasps, the beginning scene, with that funny dream interpretation, which read in conjunction with, for instance, the Derveni Papyrus, and, for instance, other sophistic texts. I use the Dissoi Logoi, a section of the Dissoi Logoi, for instance, where we see an interest in certain type of questions about language, such as, for instance, how does phonetic similarity, or how do words that sound similar relate in terms of sense? Like, how does their phonetic similarity relate to a possible semantic similarity? That is something that plays out in the practice of etymology, for instance, but it is also relevant for other questions like paronomasia, for instance, the phenomenon that words...
So punning.
Right, basically punning. And then also when we go into the evidence we have for Prodicus's thought on language, polysemy and so forth, distinguishing a word like deinos, for instance, it can have a positive and a negative meaning, or like terrible, or actually English terrific would maybe work in a similar way, right? And so he talks about this, he starts to think about this, and that is, you can see the kind of questions that are asked about, well, how do I know whether it means terrific in a great sense, good sense, or in a bad sense? Well, I look at the context, for instance. And these are questions that are formulated, for instance, in the Derveni Papyrus, and that are set up in a funny way or for the sake of comedy in Aristophanes, for instance. And if you lay it all out together, you see that these kind of discourses really interact. They ask similar questions in different ways.
Do you mind maybe just reminding listeners of the dream interpretation scene in the Wasps? I think we get so conditioned to just reading that play for Cleon or something that
right.
It can pass you by quickly. But it's such a rich scene. Do you mind just summarizing what happens in that scene?
Yeah, so it's Xanthias and Sosias. They both have to be on watch guarding the house, and they share their dreams. And they both share dreams, but maybe I focus on the longer one, which is that there's a sea monster that speaks to a crowd of sheep on the Pnyx, and it is a monster that sort of speaks with a very unpleasant voice, screaming, and at a certain point it weighs beef fat on a scale, and then other things happen with Euros and so forth. Maybe we don't need to go into all the details, but for instance, the main point is that the beef fat on the scale, in like the verb for placing on in the balance, is histe, and the beef fat is demos, and that puns with demos, the people, and dihistanai, to set apart. So the weighing of beef fat puns with setting apart the people, and that is the interpretation that is worked out for that particular scene. So yeah, you have puns here, and you have the question that I highlighted earlier, which connects directly to the passage from the Dissoi Logoi, how it comes, whether there is, and if so, how it comes, that words that are unrelated sound similar.
Well, it's such a great methodological approach, I think, because for that scene to play well with the audience, I mean, even if the dream that's described is totally absurd, that Aristophanes makes up for his characters to talk about, yeah. And even if the interpretation is totally absurd, it only works if you're kind of loosely following the rules of interpretation, right? So there's some grounding in that this is a plausible method, even if it's being parodied or exaggerated or whatever. But we get a sense of what is a plausible approach.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, to get the joke, to get the jokes, you need to be familiar. To get the quick joke, they come in quick succession. So right. You need to be familiar with this kind of practice of interpretation.
Yeah, I think it's such a great chapter, I have to say, that where you set up the one on dream hermeneutics, literary criticism, and linguistics in the 5th century, where I feel like it's all coming together. This account that begins with Penelope's description of her dream, but then, we follow through the authors, through Aeschylus, through Herodotus, and Euripides in particular. And then suddenly, I think your reader is primed to then see how this intersects with the linguistic thought, the interpretive thought of the Sophists. I mean, this is really, I think, where the book has such a high payoff. But I'm wondering if maybe we could move to part 3 of the book, where there's a real pivot from part 1. The chapter is really looking at instances of dream interpretation where there's a presumption that these dreams have somehow been sent by the gods, or that they're coming from without. They're external and they're sent to us. But then in part 3, Dreams of the Body, you introduce these authors who are beginning to theorize how maybe what I think in modernity would feel more familiar to us, this idea that they're somehow coming from within. And you start with Antiphon, who, I did not know this, reportedly wrote the first book of dream interpretation, on dream interpretation. Could you say a little bit about him and about this lost work?
Yeah, so that he wrote a book on dream interpretation is attested only in the Suda, but we have sort of that's sort of stated as a fact. Besides that, we have indirect evidence in Cicero, who draws from Stoic authors, Chrysippus and Antipater, who worked extensively, so Cicero tells us, with Antiphon's work in their work on dreams and divination. So it is not much that we have of Antiphon, but the examples that we have by Cicero, quoted, give us an opportunity to reconstruct to a certain extent what the innovative edge of Antiphon's way of interpreting dreams was. Maybe I can just briefly add that Antiphon, the sophist, I mean, there's a debate whether there were two Antiphons, the orator and Antiphon on the one hand, and Antiphon the sophist, the author of Untruths, for instance, on the other. And without getting too much into the debate, but I think there's evidence for regarding them as one, and that would also be the same person to whom is ascribed this practice of dream interpretation.
Right. Yeah. Just for listeners, we did a podcast episode last year with Josh Billings and Christopher Moore, their Cambridge companion to the Sophists. And I think in that conversation, we discussed the likeliness that this Antiphon is just one guy, one busy guy. So why in the world would dream interpretation appear then in a Hippocratic text? And so your next chapter is on Regimen, the Hippocratic or pseudo-Hippocratic text dated to about the turn of the century, about 400. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, all the datings of the Hippocratic
more
writings
or less,
is, but
okay.
Around 400 is fair.
And you write that this actually is our earliest dream interpretation kind of manual in a way. It beats the Oneirokritika by many centuries. So could you say a little bit about what the Hippocratic text, what On Regimen says about dreams? And I'm also interested in why dream interpretation would appear in a medical text.
So the De Victu or On Regimen is a very interesting text in a variety of ways. The approach it shows to dreams can be seen in this wider context that we were just outlining of the 5th century, and it fits in there in the way that it pushes aside or depicts as less important the idea that gods send dreams. It doesn't completely rule it out like other authors, Aristotle and so forth, will do later. It allows for the existence, but it doesn't care much about it. It does care about those dreams that, according to the author, give us access to the inner world of the body. That is what he's interested in, and that is what he claims to be able to understand, to handle, so that he can use dreams to understand the condition of the dreamer, especially in terms of whether there are impending diseases or not.
So this is not so much what maybe today we would think about as dream conveying information to you about what's going on in your psyche, but rather it's more somatic than that for this author. Is that right?
Yes, but the soul is an important factor in that, but being part of the body, it is very much, I mean, he describes the soul as the thing in the body that sees the dreams, and that it's sort of the language of the soul that you need to understand to be able to read it as giving information about the internal ongoings in your body. Yes. And what is fascinating about this text as a whole, maybe I should clarify the extensive list of dreams and their interpretation for diagnostic purposes, is confined more or less to the 4th book of that work, whereas the first 3 seem at first sight, or have been read as such, not directly connected to that. What I try to do in my chapter is to show that they are directly connected, and not just in the sense of that there are interesting links that has been seen before, interesting links between the cosmology that the author develops in the 1st book and the kind of the interpretation he offers in the 4th book, where again we hear sometimes about dream visions of stars, how they're moving, and that tells you something about the body, and that can be linked to the beginning. These are small, obvious links. What I'm interested in is to show that the entire undertaking that the author offers, which is to support the claim that he's able to diagnose diseases at a very early stage, namely before they show any visible signs. And he promises to be able to do this pro-diagnosis in book 1, but he only delivers on that process, I claim, in book 4, when he uses dreams and his ability to interpret them as his tool to do that kind of early pre-diagnostics that he is celebrating himself to be able to be doing.
Then the last major chapter of the book deals with Aristotle, and I think that some people might have encountered Aristotle on dreams before. It would be great to hear from you, now that you've done all of this work on the preceding authors. What is Aristotle's general approach to dreams, and how much tradition and how much innovation, I guess, is in that? In what ways is he open to traditional dream hermeneutics, and in what ways is he proposing something a little bit different?
Right. So Aristotle covers the topic of dreams in what we today call Parva Naturalia, a section of smaller writings that follow his or are consecutive to his explanation of the soul in the De Anima, and then looks in several smaller treatises, the Parva Naturalia, at how the soul interacts with the body, or how functions of the soul are worked out through the body. And he looks at memory, he looks at sense perception again, and he also looks at the phenomenon of dreaming. So there are two treatises. One is on dreams and the other is on divination and sleep. And on dreams, he develops a very sophisticated and completely novel, more or less completely novel understanding of what dreams are. I mean, of course, even there you can see connections to Plato's Timaeus and Democritus, but sort of that's really a sort of completely novel take on explaining dreams. In contrast to that, in the treatise where he then asks the question that, as I said earlier, is for the ancients very much related to the topic of dreams, namely, can dreams predict the future? In that treatise, he is, given the nature of that question, in direct conversation with that tradition that I briefly sketched so far here. And there he takes up all these questions, but of course he approaches them with the kind of scientific toolkit that he already developed as Aristotle. Nevertheless, it helps to be aware, and that's my claim in the chapter, it helps to be aware of this long tradition of asking specific kind of questions about dreams that he's very much aware of, and that he tries to develop from his perspective a satisfactory answer. Now, is there a satisfactory answer for Aristotle when it comes to the question of dreams are predictive? That's difficult. So, to cut a very long story short, he offers first of all a three-tier distinction of how dreams could possibly be seen as predictive. Dreams can be causes, he says, of actions that the dreamer performs after the dream. So I dream of something, I dream of going to the beach, and the next day I go to the beach, so that dream brought out that action. Cause is the first type. Then dreams can be signs for a disease in the body, for instance, and dreams can, in that sense, be predictive to a certain extent, like signs are of something. So here he is very closely related to the Hippocratic text De Victu. And third, they may be predictive just by coincidence. So that's not very interesting then for us, because they're not really predictive in that sense. Now, having set out that three-tier distinction, he writes a second chapter on divination in sleep. And he comes back to the question, well, these type of cause and sign that we discussed, here dreams are only predictive of things that are directly related to the dreamer, either the action that follows or what is going on in the body. So what about events that happen far away? Can they ever be predicted in a dream? And what he then offers is a very brief sketch of a revision of the theory of Democritus of how dreams can be predicted, including motions from items in the world that travel through the soul of the dreamer and so forth. Now, to bring that fully out, I would need to go into more detail about Democritus's theory, which I also do in the book, so maybe listeners can follow me up on that. And so he is quite sketchy in this regard on that question. But he has then finally an interesting paragraph at the very end of that treatise on dream interpretation, where he describes dream interpretation in a very taking up much of the tradition that I try to lay out, which is that interpreting dreams consist in identifying similarities, which is a slogan that Aristotle works with also when he describes the workings of metaphor in the rhetorics and the poetics. So there is, or so I try to bring out, for the first time, a terminological connection between dream interpretation and the understanding of what can be captured as metaphor.
So Mirjam, what are you hoping that someone who reads your book might do to carry this work forward? What do you see as maybe a next step in this? Is there another approach or author or text, or what might someone do next?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer it. But now, part of what I wanted to do is there has been quite a bit of scholarly attention to Artemidorus and so forth, that later aspect of dream. So I wanted to show how rich the tradition already is and the kind of evidence that we have earlier. So I would be interested in what sense a better understanding of the earlier period helps us to understand what comes later. I also would what I try to do is to uncover that really rich arena of questions and thoughts about what I call hermeneutic questions that are alive in these texts and around dreams, and that one should kind of try to approach them without bringing too much sort of prejudices about dream interpretation.
You wonderfully show how these dreams and these scenes of interpretation are just amazing laboratories, ways for us to spy on the cognitive wheels turning of much broader questions of how language and metaphor and poetry and the natural world, how anything is interpreted. The dreams are this laboratory for that in the different authors. And so in a way, and one thing you mentioned in the introduction, it doesn't matter that the dreams in like the earlier authors are invented dreams, because what we see is it's more in a way about watching the process of hermeneutics of interpretation unfold that's bearing the load in these texts in poetic terms and interpretive terms. In any case, I think that the approach, even for someone who maybe is not super into dreams themselves, I guess I'm just agreeing that I think that there's a lot here for the skeptics.
I hope so. And even someone who comes to the book with a pronounced interest in dreams might find it interesting in the sense of that what can be done with the evidence around dreams and here that might be different from what one expects.
Well, thank you so much, Mirjam. I have been ending each episode of the podcast this season by asking my guests if there's something that you have been doing or watching or listening to lately that has been bringing you some joy?
Yeah, if you ask me about joy, what comes to my mind are my kids. So they bring me joy every day. And what I find in connection to the topic we were just talking about, particularly joyful in a way, is their dreams and listening to how they describe what happens to them, what they experience, what their brains do to them while they are asleep, and that's really funny. So if you meet a little one, ask them what their recent dreams were and whether they remember. It's really
and maybe ask them to interpret it. You can see their hermeneutic processes.
Oh yeah, they're pretty good at that typically. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mirjam, so much for coming on the podcast. Congratulations on the really exciting book. It was a lot of fun to read, and it was a lot of fun to talk to you. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was great talking to you. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.